A quiet Australian farm, a man feeding the pet deer he had raised like family. But in seconds, trust turned to terror. The stag lowered its antlers and gored him in his own yard. As his wife screamed and tried to save him, the animal turned on her too. This is the shocking final story of Paul McDonald, a man killed not by a stranger, but by the pet he thought he knew. The air was calm over the McDonald family's property in rural Victoria, Australia. Morning sunlight stretched across the paddocks. Paul McDonald walked out to the deer enclosure like he had done countless times before. Inside was the stag he had raised for 2 years, a powerful animal he treated less like livestock and more like a trusted companion. But this morning, something was different. It was rutting season. The deer's hormones surged, instincts sharpened, and in the blink of an eye, it snapped. The stag lowered its head. Antlers like sharpened spears caught the light. And then, it charged. Neighbors would later recall the screams that pierced the stillness of the countryside. Paul's wife, Mandy, ran to the enclosure as fast as she could. What she saw was a nightmare. Her husband pinned, the stag's antlers driving into him again and again. She rushed in to save him, and the animal turned on her too, thrashing her to the ground. A frantic emergency call was placed. "The deer's got him! He's down!" But by the time help arrived, the damage was already irreversible. Paul McDonald lay fatally wounded in the yard he had tended for years, killed by the very creature he thought he could trust. Paul McDonald was no stranger to animals. At 47 years old, he lived a quiet life on his rural property in Victoria, Australia. A man who loved the outdoors, hard work, and the bond between humans and creatures. To most, deer were wild animals best admired from a distance. But for Paul, one stag was different. He had raised it from a young age, feeding it, sheltering it, and watching it grow into a massive, imposing beast. Over time, Paul treated the animal not just as livestock, but as a trusted pet, even a symbol of the simple, grounded life he wanted for his family. The stag, towering 6 feet tall and weighing hundreds of pounds, was undeniably beautiful. Its antlers branched like a crown, a striking, majestic figure in the morning mist of the paddock. Neighbors often saw Paul tending to it, unafraid, confident, believing the trust between man and animal could outweigh instinct. But that trust was built on fragile ground. Experts would later explain, a stag is never truly tame. Even after years of familiarity, one trigger could unleash its raw, primal side. And in spring, the most dangerous season of all, testosterone surged through the deer's body, sharpening aggression and fueling dominance. Paul wasn't naive. He knew the rutting season made stags unpredictable, but he believed he could handle it. After all, he had done so for 2 years without a single incident. To him, this wasn't a wild animal waiting to turn. It was his deer. That belief, that dangerous assumption of trust, set the stage for tragedy. When Paul stepped into the enclosure on April 17, 2019, he walked in as a caretaker. But in the stag's eyes, he had just stepped into a battlefield. April 17, 2019. A cool, ordinary morning in Glenrowan West, Victoria. Paul McDonald rose as he always did, quietly, methodically, with the rhythm of rural life. His wife, Mandy, prepared for the day while he pulled on his boots, ready to feed the animals before breakfast. To anyone else, stepping into a deer enclosure would be an unthinkable risk. But for Paul, it was routine. He carried the feed, walked across the paddock, and unlatched the gate with the same easy confidence he had countless times before. The deer paced inside, muscles taut beneath its coat, its antlers catching the light like blades. Paul thought nothing of it. He had raised this animal, nurtured it, and believed in their bond. But this was the rutting season. Testosterone surged, instincts boiled, and the stag, now in peak maturity, saw every movement as a challenge. Still, Paul moved calmly, without hesitation. He stepped into the enclosure, shutting the gate behind him. To him, this was just another morning. To the stag, it was the moment to assert dominance, to prove strength. The air felt charged. The deer lowered its head, antlers gleaming, muscles coiled like springs. Paul, still believing he was in control, bent slightly as he poured out the feed. It was the last calm moment he would ever know. The line between trust and terror was about to snap. It happened in a blur. 1 second, Paul was scattering feed. The next, the stag lunged. The antlers, sharp and sprawling like a crown of knives, drove straight into him. A sickening crack echoed through the paddock as Paul was lifted off his feet and slammed hard to the ground. The deer's weight bore down, its hooves thrashing, its muscles surging with raw, primal fury. Paul tried to push the animal away, but the beast was relentless. Again and again, the antlers plunged, tearing into flesh. His cries split the quiet morning air, a sound no one on the property would ever forget. From the house, Mandy heard it. A sound that didn't belong. She ran, panic gripping her chest as she sprinted toward the enclosure. And then she saw it. Her husband, pinned beneath the animal he had raised. The stag's massive frame towering over him in a frenzy of violence. She screamed his name, rushing into the enclosure without hesitation. The stag turned its fury on her, goring her with brutal force. She felt the searing pain as antlers slashed across her body, but she fought to reach Paul, to drag him free. It was chaos, hooves pounding, antlers striking, screams filling the air. The trust Paul had placed in this creature had shattered in seconds. The animal wasn't a pet anymore. It was wild. It was lethal. And it was unstoppable. By the time help arrived, the damage was catastrophic. Paul lay lifeless in the dirt, his body torn apart by the very animal he had believed he could tame. The stag stood over the scene, sides heaving, nostrils flaring, as if daring anyone else to enter. The man who had raised him was gone. Blood soaked the earth as Mandy struggled to stand. The stag had driven her to the ground, its antlers slashing deep across her body. Every movement sent waves of pain ripping through her, but she refused to stop. Her husband lay motionless just feet away. She clawed at the dirt, gasping for breath, fighting against the dizziness that threatened to consume her. The stag circled, stomping, its wild eyes locked on her. For a moment, she thought this was the end, that she too would die in the place they had once called home. But sheer survival instinct took hold. Mandy dragged herself out of the enclosure, inch by inch, bleeding heavily, every second feeling like eternity. Somehow, she slipped through the gate before the stag charged again. Behind her, the enraged animal battered the fence, antlers crashing against wood, desperate to finish what it had started. Neighbors, hearing the screams, rushed to the scene. They found Mandy collapsed, her body ripped and broken, whispering Paul's name. Her injuries were catastrophic. Deep punctures, shattered ribs, blood pouring from wounds carved by the animal they had raised with love. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, racing her to the hospital in critical condition. Doctors worked frantically through the night, stitching, transfusing, fighting to keep her alive. Against impossible odds, she survived. But Mandy's survival came at the greatest cost. The man she had built her life with was gone, and the scars she carried were not just on her body, but on her soul. The call came quickly. The animal had to be destroyed. Police and wildlife officers arrived at the McDonald property to a scene that looked like a battlefield. Blood in the dirt, broken fence posts, the guttural roars of the stag echoing from its pen. It paced violently, nostrils flaring, antlers splintered with fresh blood. The same animal Paul once bottle-fed as a fawn now stood as his killer. Neighbors stood silently at the property's edge, watching, some weeping, others in disbelief. For 2 years, the McDonalds had treated the deer like family, feeding it daily, showing it off to friends, even calling it gentle. But now, it was a monster in their midst, and the decision was absolute. Armed officers raised their rifles. The stag thrashed against the enclosure, charging at the fence with terrifying force, each impact rattling the posts. The order was given. A crack split the air, then another. The stag collapsed, its massive frame crashing into the dirt. The pet was no more. But the silence that followed wasn't a relief. It was hollow. Killing the animal didn't bring Paul back, and it didn't erase the horror of what had happened. All it did was close the final chapter of a tragic bond between man and beast. A relationship born in love, ended in blood. News of Paul McDonald's death ripped through the small rural community like wildfire. Word spread from neighbor to neighbor. from farmhouses to town pubs, until everyone knew Paul had been killed by his own deer. For those who loved him, it felt impossible to process. Paul wasn't reckless. He wasn't a man who tempted fate. He was a devoted father, a quiet and hardworking husband, a man who cared deeply for the land and the animals he raised. And now, he was gone. Killed not by a stranger, not by some accident on the road, but by a creature he trusted every day. At the local store, conversations stopped mid-sentence when Paul's name was mentioned. People shook their heads in disbelief. Not Paul. Not him. Some whispered that they had always been uneasy about that deer, while others defended the family, insisting no one could have predicted such savagery. The local news crews descended on the quiet property. Cameras filmed from the roadside, capturing police tape strung across the paddock and neighbors leaving flowers at the fence line. What was once a picture of rural serenity was now the backdrop of a horror story. For the McDonald children, the shock was unbearable. They had grown up petting the deer, laughing as it followed them around the property like a dog. Now they had to live with the memory that the same animal had taken their father's life. The tragedy became more than a headline. It became a warning. People across Australia, and beyond, asked the same question. How could something so trusted, so familiar, turn so suddenly, so fatally? And in that question was the chilling realization. No matter how tame an animal seems, nature's instincts are always waiting, just beneath the surface. In the days that followed, wildlife authorities and deer behavior specialists stepped forward to explain what had happened. And their words painted a chilling picture. The stag that killed Paul McDonald was in rut, the mating season, when male deer are driven by surging testosterone to fight, dominate, and defend territory at all costs. Even in the wild, stags have been known to gore each other to death. Their antlers are not just ornaments. They are weapons, capable of impaling and tearing flesh with brutal precision. To experts, Paul's death was not random. It was biology. The animal had not gone mad. It had simply acted on instincts sharpened over thousands of years of evolution. And therein lay the danger. Paul, like many who grow comfortable around large animals, may have underestimated just how quickly that instinct could ignite. Deer are not pets, one authority told reporters flatly. During rutting season, even the calmest male can become aggressive. No amount of familiarity makes you safe. It was a warning that resonated beyond Victoria. People across Australia who kept deer, emus, even camels and ostriches, were reminded that exotic or powerful animals, even ones raised by hand, are never truly domesticated. They live by instinct, not sentiment. Paul McDonald had treated the stag like part of the family. But in the end, when the hormones surged and the instincts took over, that deer saw him not as a caretaker, but as a rival. And in a brutal instant, the balance between man and beast tipped, with fatal consequences. When Paul fell, the stag did not stop. It thrashed, charged, and drove its antlers again and again into his body. From the house, his wife, Mandy McDonald, heard the commotion and ran to the enclosure. What she saw was beyond comprehension. Her husband being torn apart by the very animal they had fed and cared for every single day. Without hesitation, she tried to intervene. Neighbors later said her screams echoed across the property. Armed with nothing but her bare hands, she rushed at the stag, desperate to pull it away. The deer turned on her. In seconds, the antlers that had just ripped through Paul's body slashed across hers. She was gored, thrown to the ground, trampled. The force of a rutting stag, hundreds of pounds of muscle and rage, slammed into her again and again. Somehow, through sheer survival instinct, Mandy crawled away, blood pouring from her wounds. A neighbor, drawn by the chaos, pulled her to safety and called emergency services. Mandy was airlifted to the hospital in critical condition. She had suffered severe lacerations and internal injuries but miraculously survived. But her survival carried a cruel burden. While she clung to life in a hospital bed, Paul lay dead in their yard. The man she had built a life with, killed before her eyes by the animal they had trusted. For Mandy, every scar on her body would become a permanent reminder of the morning when her family was shattered. The day the stag turned predator. When first responders arrived at the McDonald property, they faced a scene that looked like something out of a nightmare. Paul lay lifeless in the yard, his body shredded by antlers and hooves. Nearby, Mandy had already been rushed away by air ambulance, clinging to life. And inside the enclosure, the stag still paced restlessly, its coat stained dark with blood. The animal that had once been a pet was now something else entirely. Authorities knew there was no question of leaving it alive. A rutting stag is unpredictable, and after killing its owner, it had crossed the line from dangerous to lethal. Police cordoned off the property. With rifles raised, they entered the enclosure. Witnesses described the deer as defiant, standing tall, antlers forward, as if daring them to come closer. It was the last stand of a beast driven by instincts no human bond could ever erase. Gunshots rang out. The stag collapsed to the ground. The danger was over. But so was the life of the animal Paul had raised from a young buck, fed daily, and treated like family. For the McDonald's neighbors, it was a grim sight. The death of a man and the destruction of the animal he had loved, within hours of each other. A tragic double ending to a story that never should have happened. The enclosure, once a symbol of novelty and pride, was now silent. Blood on the ground marked the spot where a pet became a killer, and where trust in a wild animal proved fatally misplaced. Paul McDonald's death wasn't just a freak accident. It was a brutal reminder that even the most familiar animals can turn into predators when instincts awaken. Deer are not gentle forest ornaments. They are wild, territorial creatures armed with antlers sharp enough to gore and hooves strong enough to crush. During rutting season, testosterone surges transform even a docile buck into an unpredictable threat. Paul believed his stag knew him. He fed it, spoke to it, and trusted it. But the truth is chilling. The bond he thought he had was one-sided. In the end, biology and instinct drowned out every shred of human care. What Paul saw as a pet, nature still saw as a wild animal. Wildlife experts warn this is exactly why keeping exotic or powerful animals, even those raised from youth, is a gamble with death. The enclosure that once made Paul feel in control became his graveyard. No amount of love, familiarity, or routine could erase the raw drive that surges when nature takes over. His tragedy stands as a warning. That trust, however well-intentioned, cost him his life. And the echoes of his final moments still haunt the community that watched a man be killed not by a predator in the wild, but by the animal he thought he knew best. The death of Paul McDonald ripped through his quiet Australian town like a shockwave. Neighbors who had seen the stag grazing peacefully behind fences could not believe the same animal had turned into a killer. But nature doesn't negotiate. Instinct is older, stronger, and deadlier than any illusion of control. Paul's story isn't just about a man and his deer. It's about the razor-thin line humans walk when we blur the boundary between pet and predator. The antlers that gored him weren't malicious. They were primal, a surge of wild dominance in mating season. To the deer, Paul wasn't a friend or caretaker. He was simply another rival in its territory. His death is both tragic and haunting because it was preventable. Experts say rutting stags should never be approached. Yet Paul, out of routine, out of trust, stepped inside that enclosure one final time. The price was fatal, and so his legacy lingers not just as a cautionary tale, but as a brutal reminder. The wild will always remain wild. No matter how much we feed it, love it, or believe we've tamed it, nature waits, patient and merciless, for the moment to remind us who truly holds the power. Paul McDonald's death is a chilling reminder of how quickly trust in a wild animal can turn into tragedy. A beloved pet became the instrument of his end. Thank you for watching this story. If it grips you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next tale of humans crossing paths with the untamable. And coming up next, we'll dive into another shocking case where an everyday encounter spiraled into unthinkable horror. You won't want to miss it.